Lots to talk about. Let's get to our panel. With us here in Washington is Michael Shifter. He's the president of the Inter-American Dialogue, a US-based think tank. And then we have Jennifer McCoy, served as director of the Carter Center's Americas program. She joins us from Atlanta, where she's currently a distinguished university professor at Georgia State University. Mike Weisbrot is co-director of the Center of Economic and Policy Research, also here in Washington. And George Ciccariello-Maher is an author and associate professor at Drexel University. He's joining us from Philadelphia. Let's actually start in Philadelphia with George Ciccariello-Maher. We've seen a lot of controversy and reaction to this election and this new Constituent Assembly. What is the government of Maduro trying to do here?
Well, we need to understand that Venezuela is amid a deep economic, social, and political crisis that has in recent months, and actually for the past year, become a real institutional crisis. Since the opposition took control of the National Assembly, there's really been this tit for tat between the judiciary, the legislature, the executive, that has prevented a great deal from happening. And we've seen this exacerbated by these really brutal protests in the streets that, as you've said, left more than 100 dead. And so the government is really, struggling to find a solution to this crisis. It's got to do something soon. The opposition wants the government out before the end of Maduro's term in 2018. And this was a strategy, a sort of a Hail Mary, if you will, strategy to try to break out of this gridlock by getting people together, electing a constituent assembly that might create a space for some kind of discussion to move forward.
Very succinct answer there to a very difficult problem. Jennifer McCoy, let's bring you in. You're actually part of a mediation team of the 2002 coup against Hugo Chavez. What needs to happen now? Because it looks like, as we just heard, we've got National Assembly versus Constituent Assembly, Supreme Court versus the Chief Prosecutor, Maduro and Chavistas against opposition figures. What is the way forward?
Well, it looks pretty dark right now. I agree. Space is closing. So I think at this moment, it's going to require a lot of international pressure as well as incentives. The countries are growing who are refusing to recognize the authority of this new Constituent Assembly body that was elected on Sunday, and who are really pressing for negotiations to begin again. So diplomatic isolation, refusal to recognize the authority of the decisions that this body may make, including decisions about financial transactions, international debt, bonds, that could have an effect in helping to nudge the government back toward talks. And then incentives in terms of being willing to provide emergency aid to resolve the humanitarian crisis, monitoring compliance with any agreement that might be made to ensure that everyone gets due process, that there are no witch hunts against anyone. That could help as well.
There has been, of course, international pressure in the last couple of days. We've seen the Trump administration here declare sanctions personally on Nicolas Maduro. Let's hear him talking before these sanctions, but when sanctions were put on his lieutenants. Pretty defiant.
Today, a spokesperson for Emperor Donald Trump said that they would not recognize the results of Venezuela's Constituent National Assembly election. Why the hell should we care what Donald Trump says? We care about what the sovereign people of Venezuela say.
Let's bring in Michael Shifter on that. Defiance. Sanctions from the U.S. has always been a rallying call in Venezuela. They seem to backfire sometimes when it comes to the internal politics. Do you think these will backfire and the U.S. may follow through with oil sanctions as well?
I don't think the sanctions, they may be defensible in some sense, but I don't think they have much impact, frankly.
Maduro doesn't have any U.S. bank accounts or anything, yeah.
Well, and Maduro is extremely unpopular. And the people, he has 20% or so of the vote in Venezuela, and having individual sanctions, targeted to certain individuals, him included, is not going to increase his support. It may solidify his base and his constituency, but I think the political impact in Venezuela is minimal. And let's remember the 80%. He talks about the will of the people. 80%, according to all of the polls and studies that have been done, were opposed to this Constituent Assembly in Venezuela. So the will of the people was not respected in this process.
Let's bring in Mark here. Obviously, there is calls for more international action when it comes to Venezuela. This has been going on for many months. How do you see it happening? A contact group of that's been suggested of countries that have close relations or investments with Venezuela, or a regional effort? How do you see it going forward?
Well, the most important thing is it would have to be neutral parties, like the Vatican, for example, that was involved in mediation that didn't work because neither side really made any concessions, but it was at least a positive effort. I think the sanctions that Michael and Jennifer are referring to, or the pressure that Jennifer refers to, I disagree with that very strongly. That's, you know, Tillerson actually said something.
The U.S. Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson.
Yeah, he said that just yesterday that we're considering options to force Maduro to resign, to force him out of office. Now, that's something that, you know, you have an international audience. They understand that that's a horrific threat and a terrible thing to say.
Regime change in Central America.
And that's exactly the way the U.S. is going. And the pressure that we're talking about here comes from U.S. allies, okay? That's what we have. You know, in 2013, when the opposition refused to recognize a presidential election, of which there was absolutely no doubt, South America, which had left governments then in the majority, forced the U.S. to accept those results. Now you don't have that. So now you have something that is the equivalent of, say, Vladimir Putin telling the U.S. electorate or trying to pressure the Democratic Party to accept the Republicans, and you know, or it's 100 times worse than any of the polarization that you've seen here as a result of the controversy over, you know, alleged Russian interference. You multiply that times 100. That's what you're getting from the international invention. That's what you're getting from the Organization of American States, who the Secretary General still supports even the devastating economic sanctions that opposition voters in Venezuela really don't want because it would increase hunger and poverty. That's the OAS. That's supposed to be a neutral organization, but it's completely taken over by the U.S. and its allies now, unlike a few years ago.
Interesting you brought up the opposition. Before we move on, let's just listen to Enrique Capriles, who obviously is a well-known opposition leader on the latest moves in Venezuela.
We do not recognize this fraudulent process. For us, it is null. It doesn't exist, and we are going to continue fighting until they reestablish constitutional order and democracy, and for Venezuelans to be able to fully exercise our rights. Let this be clear to the government.
So, George, Ciccariello-Maher, again, there we heard from the opposition not recognizing this new assembly, 545 delegates or so. There's been criticism that Maduro's wife and other family members have been appointed to it. You know, what happens now in terms of the situation on the ground? Because it seems like we have civil strife. Trust in civil institutions is splitting down the middle, depending on which institution you support. And when it looks on the streets, it looks like we could see something like a civil war going on. Do you see that happening?
Well, we certainly don't want that, but I mean, that's certainly the direction that the opposition has pushed this process in by boycotting this election entirely. It's not surprising that they're not recognizing the result because they didn't participate in the election. They did the same thing in 2005 and were left without representation in the National Assembly. And so now what you're seeing is a conscious choice to push harder, to push forward with what would clearly be an unconstitutional exit. The opposition consultation that it carried out a couple of weeks ago was very clear on this. It talked about military intervention into politics. It talked about forming a national unity government. None of these feature in the Constitution, and yet they use the language of defending the Constitution to press for the removal of the legitimately elected president of Venezuela. And we should worry about this a great deal because the contradictions are only heightening. If the Venezuelan government doesn't come up with some economic solutions in the short term, these contradictions are going to be even deeper, and there will be more protests in the street, and the opposition will continue to press for the overthrow of this government, which has really been their policy and their strategy, not only for the past couple of years, but for the last 15 years.